I didn't know any different. That was all I knew. Going to the beach, snorkeling on reefs, hiking hills around the island, etc. I didn't know any different to know what we had was special. Only when I left to go to school and I would come back and I had something to compare it to, really my awareness levels of what we had, the beauty of what, because I can't say I felt inspired because I didn't know anything else. Coming back, feeling inspired, going, wow, I so appreciate sort of the I don't want to call it the natural world, but the beauty of what our country has. And I had to leave to come back and appreciate it because it is so unusual.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. I'm your host, Scott Miller. Let's create a cooler world. Have you ever dreamed of running your own ecotourism business? If you enjoy being outdoors and you care about the environment, conservation, or climate issues, it wouldn't be surprising at all if you've at least toyed with the idea of starting an ecotourism business. Maybe you're listening to this episode because you run an ecotour company or you're getting ready to start one. Or maybe you just want to hear the insightful and inspiring stories that our guest today has to share. James Barrie grew up on the island of Antigua, where both his parents and his grandfather have been business owners in the island's hospitality industry. For almost 20 years, his parents ran Antigua Paddles, a successful ecotour company that was consistently rated one of the best tour companies on the island. In this episode, James is going to share Antigua Paddles' secret sauce with us. He's going to give us an insider's look at the exacting attention to detail and the commitment to creating an exceptional experience that helped Antigua Paddles succeed for so many years in a highly competitive industry. And James is more than just an observer in this story. He worked for his parents' company as a tour guide for many years, and he has an impressive resume of his own. James is the founder and president of his own marketing company, Beyond Marketing, which he's run for the past 10 years. He's also been a golf pro and was the general manager of a skydiving center, which he transformed into a multi-million-dollar venture. James also speaks very passionately from experience about the natural beauty of the island that he grew up on, the changes that he's seen in his lifetime due to climate change, and he speaks very passionately from experience about some of the ways that we can inspire people to take action on these issues. Thank you for being with us today, James.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
We today are going to talk about ecotourism and hear the story of a company called Antigua Paddles, which was founded by your parents. And I know you had quite a bit of experience working with them over the years. But first, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your background. You grew up on Antigua, right?
That's right. My father is born and raised in Antigua. I think we track our family about 5 generations through the Caribbean between the island of Grenada and Antigua. My mother's British, and I was born in England and left when I was just a baby, as my father was working in hotel management. My grandfather started a hotel, a small businessman hotel, way before tourism was a thing. And he started this hotel in 1953. And had 4 kids, one of those kids being my father. And at some point, each child was expected to run this hotel. And so when my parents came back from England with me as a baby, I was raised on this hotel. And by day, my parents ran this, I think it was about a 32-room hotel, so not real big. But they also ran a 4-star French cuisine restaurant. My grandmother was a cordon bleu chef, and my father had just come back from London managing a high-end hotel called the Park Tower off of Hyde Park. He was a night manager. So very much in our blood, and I was sort of raised into hospitality. And I was just joking with my wife the other day, as my parents were running the restaurant at night, we would be brought over food from the restaurant at age 5 and 6. I was eating escargot. not knowing that that was highly unusual. Um, so, yeah, that's sort of how I was raised, very much in the cradle of hospitality in on a very small island. For those that may never have heard of Antigua, Antigua is very small. It's 12 miles long and 9 miles wide. So, it's a dot on the map, quite literally.
Yeah, in the Caribbean, right? Basically, sort of off the coast of South America.
If you can imagine the string of islands, say from south of Miami, which is you have the Bahamas, running all the way down to Trinidad and Tobago, which is just off of South America, we're sort of right in the middle of that chain.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like with your family history, you kind of had a front row seat to learning about the history of tourism growing in the Caribbean. People are probably familiar with it as being a tourist destination, but it sounds like, with your grandfather and now your father and growing up in these industries, that you must have learned a lot about how that all developed.
Yeah, before we came on, we were talking about artificial intelligence and all that's going on, and you have to adapt. And that really is how tourism was in the Caribbean, because in the late 70s, sort of the main economy was the sugar industry, mainly sugarcane for export. And once the sugar beet was introduced, which can be produced at far less expense, so much less labor required to produce the sugar beet versus, harvesting sugarcane, it basically decimated sugarcane production throughout the Caribbean. And so, being that that was the main industry for the region, there had to be something else. And that next thing that really started happening in the early 80s was tourism. Prior to that, it really wasn't, what the Caribbean was known for at all.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, interesting, the parallel, right, to modern changes we're seeing in technology. And it's really not that new of a thing of technology changing, the world and changing how people have to work. Your interest in the environment, I know from some previous conversations, your interest in the environment apparently began at a young age. You were talking about giving a presentation about the environment on Earth Day in Antigua as a kid.
That's right.
How did that interest develop for you?
That's a great question. This is so funny that it's I'm, for the audience, I'm 46 years old. So I remember being in school and learning about chlorofluorocarbons and CFCs. It was a real buzzword then. We don't hear it as much now, I don't think. And I remember that really resonated with me. And on a tiny island, as we were living on, it was concerning because we would definitely be feeling the effects of what was to come. So I was the first junior member of what was known as EAG, the Environmental Awareness Group of Antigua. And I was invited to make a speech on Earth Day. I guess I was about 11 or 12 years old. There's a picture of me wearing a really sweet United Colors of Benetton shirt, as was the style of the day. And I was broadcast on Antiguan radio, talking about the importance of the environment and really recognizing that if we don't take care of ours, the one industry that we have for revenue and our GDP is tourism. So it was a big topic for me at the time. My entire family existed on this thing, but also just recognizing the beauty of Antigua. And the awareness levels were very high between my involvement with the AG and what I was learning in school. I was a pretty conscientious kid. I was definitely thinking, about larger issues than maybe some of my peers at the time.
So I'm curious if, in addition to like the academic interest that you had from learning about this, like I was just thinking about when I was a kid growing up in New Jersey. And I know when people think about natural beauty, they don't always think about New Jersey first, but there are actually some amazingly beautiful places in that state. And so where I grew up is not like what people call the actual Jersey Shore, but where I grew up is called the Bay Shore on Raritan Bay. And my uncle had a sailboat when I was growing up, and I spent a lot of time out on the water. And so I think that made an impression on me, just being out on the water so much, off land, just in that element. And then I can remember things like hiking through some parks, really beautiful parks near where I grew up. I remember one time when I was in high school, I actually cut school as a senior and not enjoying school as much as I once did. And I just decided to like take the day off and go get breakfast and then go walk around in the park. And I remember it was fall and there were these trees. I forget what kind of trees they were, but all the leaves had turned bright yellow and then fallen on the ground. And it was in this little like indentation where the stand of trees were, the size of a small parking lot. And so it looked like a pot of gold when all these yellow leaves from these trees had just fallen into this indentation. And so just things like that, I think, just made such an impression on me growing up. These just little moments and scenes of natural beauty that I think gave me the appreciation that I have for the natural world to some extent. So I'm wondering, in addition to your like academic interest in what you were learning in school, were there moments like that? I mean, I can imagine growing up on an island that there may have been some moments like that that made an impression on you.
In a way, I mean, I get this question on what was it like to grow up in the Caribbean? I don't know. I didn't know any different. That was all I knew. Going to the beach, snorkeling on reefs, hiking hills around the island, etc. I didn't know any different to know what we had was special. Only when I left to go to school and I would come back and I had something to compare it to, really my awareness levels of what we had, the beauty of what, because I can't say I felt inspired because I didn't know anything else. Coming back, feeling inspired, going, wow, I so appreciate sort of the I don't want to call it the natural world, but the beauty of what our country has. And I had to leave to come back and appreciate it because it is so unusual. Just as I left and started realizing that, wow, escargot is kind of hoity-toity type thing. So, yeah, and another thing that I've noticed through time is what I remember vividly as a child, say, or an early teenager snorkeling on various reefs or shipwrecks around Antigua, is years later seeing that they don't look the same how they were when I was a kid. So I think that for many, we hear about climate change and it's conceptual. Yeah, I know it's bad. I've seen it like before my eyes, and it is dramatic. And I saw a story on the news yesterday because the reefs in Florida, a particular reef that seems to have been quite resilient to a lot of what's been going on, has been quite healthy, is literally dead. And it's when you see, like, it's not like a little change, it's dramatic. Mm-hmm. And that was a challenge actually running a business or helping run my parents' business, is you take tourists out to a reef who don't have a lot of snorkeling experience. And because they see fish, they think this is great, right? Not realizing what you're looking at is a dead reef. Or sometimes, people being disappointed they're not seeing a lot. So really try to make that a learning lesson going, yeah, it's not good, is it? Because usually I see this all the time with normal tourism operators overplaying what people are actually seeing. Oh, it's great. Or did you see this or that? They didn't see much. And I would usually flip that. Yeah, it's sad. I used to swim on this reef as a kid. This is not what it ever used to be. Oh, why is that happening? Well, let me tell you about bleaching. And it's a great opportunity to teach because there's skepticism in the world today whether climate change even exists. And to be able to say, look, let's take the politics out of it. I can only tell you from my own personal experience, this used to be a lot different. And, what's the variables that are changing between then and now?
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Antigua Paddles. Let's talk about this business that your parents started. Can you tell us a little bit about how it got started and just what was it?
Oh, yeah. My parents ran a company, or were part of a company called Antours. And basically what they would do is package different tours to sell to the cruise lines. And my parents were visiting Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, which is actually where I ended up going to high school, of all places, and went kayaking down there. And it was very eco-focused. And after that kayaking excursion, they're like, gosh, we could do this. We've got, honestly, something better. than what we were seeing there, namely with mangroves. Mangroves is sort of the key aspect that we had. So, parents came back and started looking at various possible sites around Antigua and locked in on an old fisherman's cottage in a very sleepy little village on the northeast coast of Antigua, and said, gosh, this would be great. Lots of sort of elbow grease in making a fisherman's cottage have working toilets to accommodate what would end up being 150 to 160 people a day. But the idea, the concept was, let's take folks on a 3-hour experience where they would arrive at this little fisherman's cottage, and we would get them into boats, and we'd take a 5-minute boat ride over to a floating platform in the mangroves. And from there, we would teach people how to kayak and get everybody in. And then we would take them on essentially an eco paddle all through the mangroves, teaching them everything. Like it got to be where if we saw a certain bird flying by, or upside down jellyfish, or anything you point at, we would talk about and try to use storytelling as much as possible. What we've learned is that to get people to listen to things like the environment, that can be presented, in a textbook kind of way, or you can really bring it alive with your own experiences mixed in with those detailed pieces of information. So really talking about mangroves and the importance of the coastline and an ideal hatchery, if you will, for small fish. And so we would do that, a circuit for just shy of an hour, then hop into boats and then go to an offshore island called Bird Island, or actually Great Bird Island to be precise. And this was a very unique place because there is a varietal of snake on Bird Island that is unique or endemic to this time. I mean, this island is so small. I mean, it's not even 1 square mile. But there's a snake that lives on Great Bird Island called the Antiguan racer snake that is endemic only to that island, and it's truly as rare as it can be. And then talking about why it was so endangered and how that we've been able to get a producing population there. There's also a coral reef right off the coast of this island, or just off the beach. So then taking people over there and leading snorkeling through the reef and teaching before we get in what you can expect to see and what the etiquette conduct will be and whether you're wearing correct sunscreen or not. And then the other aspect of that is you could hike to the top of a cliff on the island where you would find a somewhat rare bird called the red-billed tropic bird. Spectacular, long, wispy tail. They're not rare or endangered, but you have to be in a pretty exotic place to see them. And then the great frigate birds, and talking about the frigate birds. And so just so much to talk about, so much to appreciate on this 3-hour experience. People would come back just sort of blown away by the information that they learned in a very consumable way. And then really what elevated the experience is how people were treated after the tour was over. It was counterintuitive to how most tours are run, but it generated so much word of mouth, how people were being treated overall, that, the tour was very successful for almost 20 years.
What was so special about the way they were being treated after the tour?
If you are a business that's servicing cruise lines, there's usually a morning and an afternoon tour. And usually when you are coming in with your guests, you're on the clock because the afternoon tour is on the way in the buses that are going to be taking your guests that are just arriving back to the ship. So we're very time conscious throughout this tour because we know the afternoon tour is coming. That afternoon tour cannot be late because they make no jokes. When that ship is sailing at 5:30 or whatever the time is, they will leave without you. And it's the tour operator is on the hook to get them to the next island to join the cruise, which nobody wants. Now factor in you're in the Caribbean where flat tires on buses are a very real thing. So you even have to allow for flat tires, which happened many times, which only just ratchets the stress of operating a business in the Caribbean. So we got a time thing going on, but we never want to show that there's a time thing going on ever. But what we would do is when guests would arrive on a floating dock, they would be greeted by a young gentleman or a young lady holding a silver platter with chilled scented face towels on this platter. Now, something that we even trained about was nonverbal body language, making sure that even how our body position is in making this presentation of the chilled scented face, it's always very sort of not rigid, but you're not no rounded shoulders. You're at attention. You're making eye contact with each person that you offer this chilled scented face towel to. You never grab the face towel and give it to anyone. They take it off the platter. We put a lot of thought into detail. Chilled scented face towel. They would walk up a stone path and in the most beautiful garden you've ever seen. I mean, just a stunning, well-manicured garden. There'd be foot bowls with flower petals from the garden where they can rinse their feet. Nice little touch. Then you'll be greeted by my father, who will let you know where the toilets are, and they are the cleanest toilets of any excursion they would be in the Caribbean. We always had sort of a running joke. Everyone may know how to clean a toilet, but not the way my mother cleans a toilet. So anybody who came on staff learned how to clean toilets from my mom. So, toilets over here. And then once you got back from the facilities, you'd be greeted by my mom. And my mom would offer you homemade banana bread that was made usually that day, if not the day before, usually using the bananas that are growing in said garden. And gosh, the volume. I mean, I will forever have that smell in my nose because they were preparing this at our house. We weren't in a commercial kitchen. And then you'd be offered rum punch and then the opportunity to relax in the garden. Now, most tour operators need you to get out. And we were just so insistent that what would we want? We don't want to be rushed back to the bus. So the buses would arrive and we would have another team moving everyone down to the boats while guests were enjoying the garden. And give them free Wi-Fi, knowing that Wi-Fi is very expensive on board so they could FaceTime their families back. But a culmination of that attention to detail, if you love the banana bread, well, my mom had the recipe right there for you. It was all about personal connection. And I run a marketing agency today, and you know this, in my past life, I ran a skydiving center. And everything that I've learned about business, I always had my parents' methodology of how do you make somebody feel special? Well, that means having attention to detail. And what my family and I would do is we would map out the entire customer experience from the moment that they get on their website, sending an inquiry, to the speed in which that inquiry comes back. Every touch point, when you arrive in Antigua at the port, and you come down and there's hundreds of people on the pier, and you're looking for a familiar face, finding that familiar face quickly, and that person being well dressed and being professional and have a smile and make you feel, okay, I'm going to be okay in this very foreign country. The condition of the buses. Are we giving a tour of the history of the island? We're definitely not driving across the island in silence. Every touch point. And we would ask, what would we want? What would we like to see here? And when you're in a country that's 12 miles long and 9 miles wide, with one industry, my parents had 103 competitors. And they were routinely ranked number 1, 2, or 3 because of the reviews that they were getting were just so effusive about how they were made to feel from start to finish. Scott, the amount of times that I heard my father yell to my mother at 10 o'clock at night, "Jen, come to bed." And my mom is, on the computer emailing back responses to our potential guests. And I forever have this in my mind, Scott, this expression from my mom: response, response, response. It's just so dog eat dog. So, even coming back to the eco side of this, what would we want on an eco tour? I want somebody that's passionate about the environment. It seems like it's a silly starting point, but that's not always the case. Someone that really loves it and is willing to take the time to educate themselves on just about everything. And that was me. I was one of six guides. And the fervency of me wanting to learn what was all around me, and from that learning, this greater appreciation. And then wanting to share those details, with every guest that was coming on. But I feel like there's so many lessons here between eco and how to have a successful eco-focused tour, to marketing via word of mouth marketing, to even business philosophy. It's sort of all wrapped into one, because as a marketing agency, we work with a lot of skydiving centers in the world. And I go, just imagine if you had 100 other skydiving centers in your town. Which skydiving center is going to be the busiest and the best? The one that treats people better than the others.
Yeah. 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 It's so easy to think when you have a great experience, right? Like, hey, we're taking people and letting them jump out of an airplane for the first time in their life, right? Or we're taking people on this amazing tour in this beautiful location where they're going to be paddling around and seeing these amazing things in this beautiful crystal clear water. And that is enough for so many people, right? They're just going to be blown away by the experience. They're going to be fine with dirty bathrooms. And yet, when you go that extra mile, that's what really allows you to differentiate and make it that experience that people are really going to talk about, or that one thing that they're going to talk about that makes you stand out or makes that experience stand out. That's it. That makes so much sense when you talk about it that way.
I could summarize it this way. How do you exceed expectations? The challenge with running any business in the Caribbean, especially an eco-focused business, because that brings even a higher awareness level. But when people come to the Caribbean, they're expecting beautiful water. They are expecting guides on a tour to be well-versed. They are expecting. So in other words, I could rephrase it. How do you exceed expectations when expectations are already so high? And what I've learned is, growing up in hospitality, you can be militant hospitality. You could go to a place like a 3-star Michelin restaurant in New York City, and because the expectations are so high, it's almost like everyone is almost walking on eggshells to put foot wrong, because you're about to drop $600 on a meal. Or there's a different kind of hospitality going, how do I resonate with somebody's heart? How do I connect with not your brain, but your heart, who you are? And that's totally different. So we tried to implement that in the business of not trying to be hoity-toity great hospitality, the opposite, of treating you with such respect, but showing enough thoughtfulness that we are looking to make sure that you, feel well taken care of. Because when you feel confident, especially, again, here's where the word is empathy, is when you land in a country that is foreign to you, you don't know who's safe, who's not safe, what's right, what's wrong. Everything's different from what you know. So your awareness levels are even higher. A real big detail we were big about is when they got off the bus, which was a rough ride because the island's roads are so terrible. After a 40-minute drive across the island, we always made sure that when they arrived at the top of the hill, sort of where the parking lot was, before we walked them down to where the boats were, our entire team was there. Again, nonverbal communication, making sure that we're astute and ready to greet them, and always smiling and saying literally, welcome. My big thing, because as a tour guide, I've done hundreds of tours through the years. Hundreds and hundreds. And I was doing 2 tours a day. I don't want to say the word complacency, but you say that you're pointing out and saying things many, and I had to, as a personal challenge to myself, I would say this to my guests. Welcome to Antigua Paddles, everyone. My name is James. It is a pleasure to have you today. It is my goal to ensure that when we get back here in 3 hours, you feel as if you've had one of the best experiences in the Caribbean that you have ever had. Are you ready? Now, that gets the energy up with them. Ooh, but now I got to deliver. I just threw something out big. And I would do that every single day. They see I'm into it. The more they're into it, the more I'm going to thrive. but I never just want to show up and do the thing. So that was there was so much, as I recall a lot of what we did. It was just a lot of nuance, a lot of reading people. That's another sort of skill, is reading their nonverbals. Where are they at? So yeah, what a 20-year time that was with this company.
Yeah, and this is something I remember you were working at the skydiving center that you mentioned earlier. You would still go back there in the winters when things slowed down and spend time doing these tours. So this is something you did over an extended period, even as you were off launching other careers. So you talked about the mangroves. Tell us a little more for somebody who's never been to Antigua and doesn't know what mangroves are. Tell us a little more about, like, what does this look like? What are these mangroves, and what is this place like that you're taking people?
Yeah. So, mangroves are, so many people will look at a mangrove and just see a plant that's growing in the water. Totally take for granted what it is. So there are many different varietals of mangrove, and they are so unique because they create a buffer on the coastline. When you have tidal surge, for example, it really protects your coastline from erosion. So that's a very big thing. Secondly, when you typically are in a mangrove environment, it's so calm. It's like flat water still. Usually, when you have water that's coming in ashore, it sort of rebounds. If you just think of a beach, it's rough, it's turbulent. You don't have any turbulence. So it is the perfect nurturing ground for small fish. You name the species, they typically start in a mangrove environment. And then as they mature, they go out to deeper waters.
And these are like basically the size of trees, right? These mangroves?
Yeah, they're big. I mean, they're real big. And how they grow is so interesting. You'll literally have sort of a pod, and it's been a minute since I've given these tours. So I used to know the terminology, even the scientific terminology, extremely well. But basically, a pod will drop off of the mangrove, and it may float in time. But once it comes to a still area, it will essentially take root and propagate, even though it's completely separated from, the main plant. It's just remarkable in terms of how it grows, but it's extremely dense. And you have all these sort of spider roots everywhere, which gives it that density, which is what really helps buffer down the tidal energy, if you will. There's so many different varietals of mangrove. Ours specifically was a red mangrove, as it was called. But what we tend to see is that mangroves are on the coast. And throughout the Caribbean, the major problem is that whenever there's usually hotel development, mangroves are the first thing to go. And because the tourism dollar is the almighty dollar, and many of the islands in the Caribbean are really poor because we have a major industry in tourism that basically goes dormant from, essentially April through November, as we get into hurricane season. So everything gets very quiet. So, if there's going to be development or opportunity economically, it's going to be there and the environment gets completely washed over. But the damage that's caused when you destroy mangroves is enormous because you introduce erosion and you're having a direct effect negatively on your fisheries. Of interest too, one thing that's very present in a mangrove environment are sea cucumbers. And there's a lot of entrepreneurs throughout the Caribbean, and we saw this where, you would think a sea cucumber doesn't have much value to many people, but we started seeing a lot of fishermen cruising through mangroves, picking up sea cucumbers for exports to China, where it's a delicacy. So anything to try and make a dollar, but the impacts of sea cucumbers that help filter or keep the water clean, you start messing with that, there's always a domino effect. But the mangroves are sort of the wellspring of life.
I'm picturing kind of like a floating forest when I picture the mangroves. Is that kind of what it looks like?
Yeah. I think that's pretty good. Obviously, the roots go well down into the soil. Usually it's a sandy type environment. But yeah, I mean, it's big. A mangrove environment, it propagates quickly and it's very dense.
Yeah. And sea cucumbers look like little floating fruit from what I remember or from what I've seen. Is that?
They don't float. They're always on the sea floor, and they look like, for really a lack of a better description, a large piece of poo. They are most uninviting and very entertaining. When I would pick up a sea cucumber and show people, it was always a freak out moment. And by the way, that was so big. We would often call what we were doing having a floating classroom. If we could, at the very least, show if it was something as safe as picking up a sea cucumber or a starfish. That was a real big thing where we would have a floating classroom, pick up a starfish, and tell them about how extraordinary a starfish is, how we take it for granted in terms of what it looks like, but how it regenerates if you cut off an arm, or how they actually traverse quite a bit through the sea. It just makes it come alive so much more. It's one thing to tell, it's another thing to have them touch and go, wow, provided that it's not hurting anything.
Well, yeah, it's one thing to like watch it on a video or see it in a classroom, hear about it in a classroom, but it's very different to be out there in the actual environment where these things are living and to experience that, to learn about them while you're right there with them, to learn about these things.
One of the things that my colleagues would tease me about, but it was very impactful, is we would go to a quiet bay where very quiet, very mangrove filled, and we would talk about turtle grass. So there's sort of a seabed of grasses that turtles like to eat, and it was not uncommon to see turtles in this bay, hawksbill turtles specifically. And to tell a story from my childhood of me being on a beach and seeing a turtle coming ashore and laying its eggs, and sharing with them, not that it laid the eggs, but how it did it, and how careful it is about, making sure that the nest is covered up, and talking about the ability for, say, a turtle to navigate in the world's oceans with extraordinary accuracy, teaching people that usually a sea turtle will return to the very same beach from which itself was born, sometimes 20 years later, or having tracked turtles to swim as far as the west coast of Africa, right back to its beach 2,000 miles away on this little tiny rock in the Caribbean that is Antigua. And sharing the stories of what I saw and how extremely dynamic these animals are just suddenly makes it more real. And I would say that for anyone thinking about giving a tour, particularly if it's an eco-focused tour, make it personal. Add stories. I literally, Scott, many times I had people literally tearing up when talking about my personal experiences and how remarkable these animals are, and then the plight that we have, with these animals, and also just the survival rate of just a baby turtle even making it out there. For a turtle of any age, you have to really appreciate it, because it's beating tremendous odds, because once they get into the water, all bets are off at that very small size. So
everything's trying to eat them, I guess.
Everything, seabirds from the top can see them because they're not really diving. Little baby turtles are looking for flotsam, which is floating debris to sort of lag onto and sort of camouflage and just sort of ride with the currents. But, large fish, and certainly birds from above, or, a major issue is with so many more people living on the coast, when they turn their lights on, or if they fail to turn their lights off at night, when baby turtles are being born, really their natural inclination is to look for the reflection of the moon on the water. And so they will start heading in that direction. But if there's light coming in from inland, often they will go in that direction, and they're picked up by rats or just never make it to the water by sunrise, of which then there's little to zero chance of survival. If they do make it to the water, even the chances of survival are minimal. So when you have that framework, when you have that understanding, go, wow, you see it on TV, all these baby turtles going out, you think, oh, that's great, but maybe one might survive. Maybe one. I can't remember the stat on it, but it's like the odds are so against. So when you have that framework and understanding, and then you see a turtle, your appreciation of it is so much greater. You're going, gosh, that thing has not only swum the world's oceans, possibly, but it's the very fact that it's that big. Because this thing's a survivor, and I just appreciate it so much more.
Yeah. You were talking about the coral, just I guess to switch topics a little bit. You were talking about the coral and coral bleaching. Could you talk about that a little bit so that people understand what that is?
Yeah. So bleaching is basically mass death of a coral reef system that occurs when water temperatures get above a certain threshold. And this is a worldwide phenomenon occurring. And I think if there's the loudest alarm bells going on right now are at the Great Barrier Reef, what has almost really been a major tourist attraction for Australia with the Great Barrier Reef is going through crisis. And as recently, as this week, I mean, we're hearing now of water temperatures this summer being 100 degrees. Like, I mean, normally when on a 100-degree day, you go in the water to cool off. Now you just don't even want to go in the water because it's just equally as hot. But this event is so catastrophic, which is going to affect, again, so much sea life as coral reefs are home to so much. But when you see a bleached coral reef, you still see the coral heads, but they're literally gray. They're just grayed out. It almost looks as if like they were on fire. And now it's sort of like the remaining ashy look of a reef. And what's so interesting, having taken so many people snorkeling who've never been to a reef before, because they see fish, they think they don't know what they're looking at. But, it's only going, I don't know if you realize this, but 90% of what you just saw was dead. And I don't want you to leave here thinking that this reef is thriving because you saw fish. Or some people would leave negative reviews online going, we went, we didn't see anything, and the reef was dead, as if it was unique to us. This is a global problem. And scientists are down actually pulling coral out of the water to try and get them to grow in tanks right now so that something can be preserved and grown and hopefully be brought back into the ocean. But there's another crazy phenomenon going on. I don't know if you're aware of this, Scott, called Sargasso seaweed. When I was growing up, I never even heard of it. And now you cannot go to any place in the Caribbean without experiencing Sargasso seaweed. And it is major amounts of floating debris, which is actually very helpful for things like sea turtles because it's flotsam at sea. But when it comes ashore, it comes ashore in mass. My wife and I went to Belize last year, and I you just wanted to cry. I mean, it was like for maybe 50 yards from being on the sand, 50, maybe even more yards out of nothing but Sargasso seaweed. And you'd have workers at resorts literally raking all day long. And they finally have this beach clean. You come back the next morning, there it is again. And tourists hate it. Once it comes on shore, it starts drying out and it smells terrible, like rotten eggs. And so many people are looking for ways to repurpose it, but it's got traces of arsenic in it. So when it starts drying out and getting crusty, it's actually a bit of a health hazard. But the theory on Sargasso seaweed is that we're getting so much sort of waste runoff that is causing these blooms never seen before in history. And another aspect of sort of what we're doing that's causing this negativity to our environment.
Decades ago, we're hearing people talking about climate change. I mean, this is not something new. This is not something that's just been happening in the last few years. There were people talking about this decades ago, back in the 70s, even earlier than that, talking about climate change and the potential impacts. How long has there been a discussion, or how much of a discussion has there been over the years about the impacts that climate change will have and the impacts on tourism, the impacts on the economy? Is this something that people are just starting now to take seriously, or have there been discussions about that for a while now?
there's been discussion, but never any action. And the action is only starting to occur in the Caribbean because it's affecting money, the driver of everything. The environment has always been a conversation of that big thing in the future. The future is here now, where it's causing an impact on on the economy. And now it's like, oh, that thing that we've been talking about for the last, probably in the Caribbean, 30 years is now something that we actually have to take action on. The reality is the Caribbean doesn't export very much. We don't produce much, particularly Antigua, because Antigua is such a dry island. It's one of the driest islands in the Caribbean. So we are so focused on the tourism dollar. And with what's happening, it's a major problem. And now they're like, oh, suddenly everyone's an environmentalist.
Yeah. I think Winston Churchill once said, you can count on the Americans to do the right thing once they've tried everything else. And that seems to be a generally human trait, unfortunately. And this has implications not just for the islands, but also look at places like Florida that are so dependent on tourism. And if the beaches are now no longer appealing, like what impact is that going to have?
I was recently in the Outer Banks and stunned to literally see homes that are within the next couple of years are going to be toppling into the ocean.
Yeah.
It's stunning to see that. And we stayed in North Topsail Island a couple of years back, and we were noticing that, wow, some of these homes for sale are a little more reasonable than we would have imagined, realizing that in 20 years' time, they won't be there.
Right.
It's such a stark reality.
Yeah. When I first asked you to be a guest in the podcast, you said something along the lines of, like, as a disclaimer, that Antigua Paddles was not some, shining pillar of ecological perfection, right? Like, you were using speedboats to take people out to the mangroves. But there's this idea, and I think you and I have talked about this before in business in general, that if you wait until everything is perfect, you're never going to get started. Right? That you have to start somewhere, and sometimes you just have to start with what you have and then build from there. Was there ever a concern that, like, it wasn't good enough? Like, oh, look, we're using, speedboats to bring people out here. We're relying on cruise lines, which are not the most, ecologically friendly thing on the planet. Was there ever a concern about that?
Always. You can't call yourself an Ecotour and then at least not act like one. Case in point, look, we gave water to everybody. There's the convenience of water bottles being given out, small water bottles, say after 45 minutes of kayaking. Or no, we could have a 5-gallon Gatorade thing and use plastic cups that we would wash. I can't even tell you, we were washing 160, 180 cups a day. It's a lot easier to use plastic cups. It just gets thrown away, but it was not at the heart of what we wanted to do. So there's trade-offs. There's certain things, if we can control it and be more ecological and economical, then that's what we would do.
Yeah, it sounds like there was a focus on doing what you can, controlling the things that you could control, and then just accepting that we can't do everything as ideally as we might want it to be. Does that sound accurate?
We make no bones about it. We tell people that. People would comment, oh, that's a gas guzzling engine you're using on this Ecotour. Yes, sir. Don't have an alternative here in the Caribbean. Just don't. Not on this island. Tell us what that is. We'll do it.
Not unless you want to row, sir. Right?
Precisely. Pretty much. And I will say, Scott, many people called us out, particularly on the issue of using traditional boat engines. But we never wanted to be acting holier than thou as environmentalists. The asset, I think, that we brought is how many people did we impact by teaching through storytelling, teaching through personal experience, show and tell. Because the environment is such a hot topic, it can become militant, where you want to beat people over the head with how they should be living to reduce their carbon footprint. I don't think that there's any argument in anything in society that says, hey, forcing your opinions on somebody or forcing your way on somebody else is going to be effective to them. So in the case of an ecotourism aspect where we're passionate about the environment, let's share with people. Let's not tell people how they should go about things. Let's share them and show them and show them, hey, these are the impacts that the environment is making. And I would say this all the time. Hey, let's take politics and the news and throw that out of the window. I'm just going to tell you my personal experience. I used to swim on this reef my whole life. And what you're seeing today saddens me. It never used to be like this. It never used to look like this. You take that information however you want to take it. But that's because of bleaching. And that's because of temperature change. How you want to say why the temperature is hotter, that's up to you. But I'm just saying that there is an impact here. And leave it there. Your choice to decide. But it's making people think. I'll say this is sort of on a different aside, but it's kind of the same as what we're talking about is empathy. If you're an eco-tour operator, your goal is not to be perfect ecologically. You do the best you can, as we discussed, but to get people to have empathy for what's happening. I was just in Charleston this past weekend, and my wife and I went to the International African American Museum. And I think some people might shy away from a museum if you're white, because the Black experience may be overwhelming to you. But we went there and left with so much empathy. The storytelling of African American history in this country was so well done that here's the information, here's the facts, here's what happened. Not, this is how you should feel. This is how it is. This is how it was. This is what is still happening. And you leave with your own assessment. And for me, it was, oh man, I was emotional. And here's another piece of technology as it relates to the environment that's starting to happen is I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and there's this, I can't remember the name of it. There's a water company. They drill for water starved communities in Africa. And I heard the CEO speak, and it was great, but I didn't rip out my checkbook to hear about all that they were doing to give people water in a country that's thousands of miles away that I've never been to, that I can't really truly understand because I've never been without water. And so we come out of this, and he's fundraising, but I do nothing. And then we go out into the lobby, and they have VR goggles. And I put on these VR goggles, and I look to my right, and there's a villager who's emotional. He's crying because they just tapped a well. And there's water gushing out, and his life just changed. And the life for his family just changed. And suddenly I had empathy. I understood what this means. And I'm hoping that with VR, that we can get greater empathy for what's happening in the environment. I was reading about some of the candidates that are running for president and their take on the environment. It's very disheartening. And I think, why? For you and I on this podcast and this conversation, it seems almost obvious what's happening. Why is it that people don't see it the way that maybe we're seeing it? My theory is lacking empathy. And I'm hoping that technology will help with that.
There's a great opportunity in all of this that's emerging to have people share their stories and experiences. Like if we're really going to move people, you can present as many facts as you want. But when people are able to share their own personal experiences, like you did, sharing your own personal experiences of growing up on Antigua and what the place means. I mean, that's coming through even when you're talking from a scientific perspective about the mangroves. The thing that still comes through is what it means to you as somebody who grew up there. Right. And so when we have people who can share those experiences and share their stories and share emotionally what these things mean to them, whether we do that through technology or whether we do that with a person standing right in front of you, there are great opportunities there to inspire people to take action or to think about things differently.
you asked me, what's a piece of advice I'd have for anyone starting, an Ecotour? I would give this advice to anyone starting any business, especially an Ecotour: exceed expectations. Connect with people on the heart level, not the brain level, because the brain level is what everyone's doing. I can serve you facts and information, or I can try and resonate with you by this storytelling, by my experiences, by showing you, by the sadness of what's happening in front of us. It's empathy. If we're going to have change in the world, we need people to not conceptually understand chlorofluorocarbons. It's bad. Yeah, okay, it's bad. Got it. It's bad. Oh, wow, look what's happening. Look how people's lives are changing. Oh, I care for that person. I've created a relationship with this tour guide. Look how passionate he is about where he comes from and the environment he's living in. And look what's happening to his environment and how it's affecting his livelihood. Oh, there's personal connection here. I care a little bit more. Even same thing, anything societally. It's almost the same thing. We're so strong in our postures that we're not listening to each other. And I think that there's a great parallel there with even coming to the table and saying, all right, you don't believe in climate change? Okay, I respect where you come from. Would you respect mine to share why I think different? Can we have a conversation? And being okay with walking away from the conversation, not hell-bent on changing it, just share. No agenda. I just want to share.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There are some opportunities there if we're willing to take them. Well, James, you were recently a guest on my other podcast, Task Time Energy,
Yeah.
and I asked you the question at the end of that podcast that I always ask people, and I think I'd like to ask you a slightly different question this time. In terms of what we're talking about, in terms of the environment, in terms of being more aware of our impacts on the environment and whatever it is that each of us can do individually in our lives to address these issues, what are you doing right now in your life that you feel good about?
Trying to be smaller. My wife and I have had reasonable success with our business, and we started looking at building a home. And our goal was actually for the home to be net zero, was the goal. However, looking at the footprint that we were having to go through to create it, it was, the end result would have been great, but sort of the question sort of came up, do we need that or do we want it? We could be, way more green by having a net zero home, or we could stay in the smaller home that we're in right now and try and make it more efficient. Just being a little bit smaller. And we decided, we're sticking in a home that we bought in 2006, and there's the nice to haves, and there's just sort of do we need this? Can we sort of live smaller within our space and just sort of simplify? Do I desire the net zero home? For sure. But can I make the home that we're living in just more environmentally friendly? Because as I go off to my net zero home, some joker behind me is going to be living in my non-efficient home. So rather than going bigger and better and spending more and, doing as the Joneses do, just going, look at what we have. How do we make it better? How do we make it more efficient? And just sort of be smaller in that realm. And that feels good. So, yeah, from an environmental standpoint, that's something I'm pleased with. Is sometimes we think that forward progression in our lives is acquisition of more. And I'm really starting to think more of acquiring less.
Yeah, that seems like a really important question to ask, even as we look at these, important decisions in our lives and trying to have a more positive impact on the world, thinking, well, is this something I want, or is this something that I really need? Asking that very important question. And is less actually more? Well, James, thank you so much for sharing all this today and for everything that you've taught people. This has been very, very informative and inspiring. So thank you very much for being a guest today.
Thank you for having me, Scott. I love talking to you. make my day, and I've really enjoyed being on the show.
As we mentioned earlier, these days James is the president of a company called Beyond Marketing. They're at beyondmarketing.xyz. And I can tell you, after knowing James for many years, he applies the passion, the attention to detail, and the desire to exceed expectations that you heard him talk about in this podcast episode to everything that he does. If you're looking for help with marketing, definitely give his company a look. And I'll include that link in the show notes. If you know James from the skydiving world and you haven't heard his podcast, The 20-Minute Call, definitely give that a listen. I was just listening to an episode that James did with my old buddy Sonic, and that was really fun to listen to. James is also working on a new podcast called The Entrepreneur's Journey, which will be available soon. If you're a leader who wants to improve your ability to delegate, if you want to improve other crucial time management skills that can help you be a more effective leader, if you want to improve your ability to manage teams of people who think and work in different ways, I would love to help you with that. I'm a certified leadership and executive coach. I have extensive experience leading high-performing teams of highly skilled and experienced professionals. I love helping leaders learn to use their time more effectively and discover more enjoyment and satisfaction in their work. These days, I'm especially interested in people who are asking themselves the fundamental question that we ask in this podcast, which is, what can I do? What can I do about climate change? How can I live and work in a more sustainable, environmentally conscious way? How can I help create a cooler world? If you're looking for answers to those questions, check out my website, scottmillercoaching.com, or send me an email. My address is scott@scottmillercoaching.com. Today's podcast is sponsored by our oceans. Yes, I'm talking about those giant bodies of water that you see all over our planet. In fact, oceans cover 71% of the Earth's surface. Oceans influence and regulate Earth's climate. They act like the planet's heart. Ocean currents circulate heat and moisture around the globe, similar to the circulatory system in your body. And those ocean currents are just as vital to the health of our planet as your circulatory system is to your body. If you want to know what you can do to help the world's oceans, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, has a great webpage showing 10 simple things you can do to help the ocean. I'll include that link in the show notes, and you can find it on our podcast website at creatingacoolerworld.com. And I'm going to invite you to join me in a little challenge. If you go to that webpage showing the 10 simple things that you can do to help the ocean, and you pick one of those things that you're not doing, and do it this week. Just one thing. If you're already doing all 10 of those things, then see if there's a new way that you can do one of those things, or maybe an even more effective or impactful way than you're already doing it. That's our little ocean challenge for this week, and I hope you will join me in that challenge. So what are the dogs doing? Last time I looked, Maple was chewing on a stuffed toy pony that is one of his favorite toys. Bugs seemed to be enjoying a few minutes of peace and quiet while Maple was distracted by a toy. So that's all we got this time. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode. And until then, take care.